I just wanted to correct the record on a couple things since I had a wonderful interview with Brother George. Go check it out when you have a chance. As you know, when we're spitballing things for about an hour and a half, it's easy to make a couple of mistakes on some minor details. So, number one is when Jesus talks about not getting justice for yourself in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42. It's a sole focus on vigilantism and misapplying the Torah, if you will. And that is something I will discuss for sure in another video. And the second thing is that this teaching in the New Testament of love your friend and hate your enemy is a teaching of the Zealots. Mind you, there are four main sects in operation at this time. Of course, there are obviously ones that are not as significant, but that would be the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and then the Zealots. Now, if you know what is biblically required, you can distinguish between the commandments of God and the Takanot and the Masim of the rabbis. The Takanot and the Masim being the deeds as well as the enactments of the sages. And right now, there are many Jews in a mourning period during this time of the Omer count for Rabbi Akiva and 24,000 of his students. This is based all in tradition and not in the Bible itself. Now, during this time, many forego marriages. They also forego shaving and listening to live music, among other things. But why are we ignoring this thing in the Bible that's very clear, where it says, "What Elohim has joined together, let no man separate"? So if there's a couple that's desperate to marry during this period of time because they want to become one flesh, like it talks about in the Bible, they can't, which I believe intrinsically counteracts what God's intention was. In fact, we read in Titus, Paul tells us very clearly to beware of Jewish fables. And when he says beware of Jewish fables, he's not talking about the Torah and the Tanakh, because many of us would agree, quite frankly, that millions of Israelites, who were a mixed multitude, by the way, and not just southern tribe Jews, were there at Mount Sinai when they were given the commandments. So when Paul talks about Jewish fables, he's talking about Haggadot that are written about in Jewish traditions, because a lot of laws and customs and nonsense that falls outside of the Bible are created based in these stories than pure biblical fact and history. Now, the exception to this would be Lag BaOmer, which they celebrate as the 33rd day of the counting towards Pentecost. The thing about this is 33 is an interesting number. I mean, we all know how much the Masons love the number 33. And it sounds arbitrary because it is. We don't read of any holiday occurring on the 33rd day of the Omer count in Scripture. And even during Purim, a lot of people were reading Esther Megillat because they have been taught that hearing the reading of Esther twice is required of them, and therefore that's another addition to Scripture in violation of both Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2 and Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 32, where Yahweh explicitly states, "You shall not add or take away from this word which I am giving you." And now we need to see how some things that we can actually deduce from the Bible have been gatekept by people changing the translations. In Jeremiah 8:8, we're warned, "How can you say, 'We are wise, and the law of the Lord is with us'? Behold, the lying pen of the scribes has made the law, or the Torah, into a lie." Now, you might have a Tanakh only Karaite objecting to a divine Messiah, and a Sadducee or a Torah only person objecting to the idea of a Messiah altogether. But if we look at Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43, there was a revision done by scribes resulting in several different translations of that verse, which could contribute to this disbelief in a Messiah or perhaps a divine Messiah. Because in the Masoretic text edition, there are words that we don't find that were originally there. So let's look at Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43 in the Septuagint version, which is a more complete verse, versus the Masoretic version. Okay, first the Septuagint. "Delight, O heavens, with him, and worship him, you sons of God. Delight, O nations, with his people, and prevail with him. all you angels of God. So what you see in the orange is what's going to be missing in the next version. It says, "For he will avenge the blood of his sons, and he will avenge, and he will repay the enemies with vengeance, and he will repay those who hate, and the Lord will cleanse out the land of his people." And the Hebrew word there for cleanse is an atoning kind of cleansing. It's a vicarious atonement kind of cleansing. And it's a Levitical, in a way, kind of a cleansing. And we'll see that in just a minute. One thing I'd like to point out as far as consistency between the two versions is the fact that the nations are included in the worship of the one God of Israel, something that isn't really taught in the religion of Judaism. This is highly important because the nations are viewed as equals so long as they're submitting to the one God of Israel. In Deuteronomy 32 and verse 43 of the Masoretic versions, we see, "Cry out, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge his servant's blood. He will take vengeance against his enemies and make atonement or at-one-ment for his land and people." Those in Judaism definitely would not like that this is a divine person being worshipped as well as making atonement, because they believe that anybody that makes atonement who is not an animal, let's say, is a human sacrifice. So the Hebrew word for atone there is kafar, which means to expiate in like the sense of a high priest, let's say, making an offering on behalf of the entire nation. We read in Leviticus that it's the blood that atones. So now we have a divine being who's operating as a stand-in and atoning, which many in Judaism say is not biblically permissible, but here we see that it is. And we would not know that had we not dug deeper than just looking at the versions that we see from the lying pens of the scribes. So I know everybody can have their beliefs, but I do genuinely believe that Deuteronomy 32:43 points to the crucifixion of Yehoshua, but also his ultimate return to redeem his servants and those who have followed the commandments of God faithfully and who have been wronged in the process. Another example of the lying pen of the scribes, so to speak, is in Isaiah 53 and verse 10, where we need to examine the Jewish Publication Society's translation of the verse versus the more standardized or Christian translations of this verse. The JPS seems to indicate that the suffering servant is acknowledging his own guilt while in a state of contrition, whereas the Christian version of Isaiah 53 and verse 10 seems to indicate that the suffering servant, who in Christianity they believe is the Messiah, this would include obviously myself, is making vicarious atonement for the people of Israel and of course the world. It's just up to them to choose whether or not to participate in this form of imputed righteousness. So while in the Christian tradition, "he shall prolong his days" might be seen as a reference to resurrection, it's a bit different with the Jewish Publication Society's translation, which a translation directly feeds into theology, if you want to be blunt about it. In other words, the translations that they use in Judaism and Christianity feed into the theologies that people believe, and typically the theologies that people believe feed into the kinds of translations that they see appearing for their Bibles. So it's also a vice versa kind of a thing. It goes both ways, so to speak.